All right, so we're going to start today talking about internal parasites, and then we'll see how much time we have to move on to another topic. Can you guys hear me okay? Face nods. Okay, excellent. All right, so internal parasites. Oftentimes, we don't see them doing a ton of harm until they get to large numbers. So certainly there are some instances where they can cause a lot of internal damage and disease, some of which we touched on last week when we talked about what? Colic, thank you. Somebody was listening. All right, so signs of parasitic disease run the gamut from just a dull hair coat or unthriftiness to severe colic and even death if it's bad enough. So certainly important that we learn about our different parasites and know how to control them. All right, so our biggest issues tend to be that they take nutrients away from the horse. So we spend a lot of time and money feeding our horses, right? So whether they're on pasture, they're getting extra hay, they're getting grain, they're getting a ration balancer, they're getting supplements. If those parasites are hanging out in their gut, they're going to take away some of those nutrients that we would prefer our horses to use. All right, they can cause damage to the internal organs. We'll talk about that. And certainly can cause obstipation or stopping of movement of the intestinal tract to where things aren't passing. And those would be certainly are more severe forms. All right, so establishing that effective parasite control program is really, probably our number 2 thing that we need to do to keep them well in just a general husbandry situation. All right, we're not talking about usefulness, but trying to keep them just healthy, hanging out at the farm. All right. So unfortunately, there's like 150 different species of parasites. Well, luckily, we're not going to talk about all of those. All right. We're going to talk about the most common ones. Certainly small strongyles, ascarids, tapeworms, and pinworms are the ones you're going to hear most about. We'll add a few others in there as well. All right. So things like bots, threadworms, neck threadworms, bloodworms and lungworms we can see as well, but tend to cause fewer problems for the general population. All right, so our parasites go through life cycles, and we're going to get more specific as to the individual life cycles, but typically they start out as an egg, they develop into a larva, which is an immature worm, and then eventually they will be an adult or a mature worm, and those mature worms then lay the eggs to keep the process going. All right, so our eggs are typically deposited on the ground in the manure from that infected horse. The eggs are going to hatch, and that infective larva are going to develop in the environment. And every type of parasite has a slightly different life cycle and longevity, but eventually that parasite is going to be swallowed while the horse is typically grazing. And then the development of the larva up into the adult happens within the horse. So transmission and longevity in the environment is going to depend on temperature. So we have different issues than they do in Florida or they do in Canada because of our different climates. All right, so as those larvae start to mature within the horse's digestive tract, they can also migrate through other tissues. So although we think of them as intestinal parasites, they can do damage to other organs as they travel around the horse's body before getting back into the intestine where they mature into adults to lay eggs. All right, so small strongyles are weird in that they can have kind of an abbreviated time within adulthood, and they basically just hang out, or I'm sorry, in larva, they can either just hang out for a little bit or they can hang out for a really long time within the intestine. And those are called encysted strongyles. So although the average is 1.5 months for them to kind of go through that process, they can actually sit there and hang out for several years. So even though you may not have dewormed your horse for a while, they could still have, or you've dewormed your horse, if it's been a while, they can have parasites still hanging out within them. All right, so small strongyles are going to burrow into the lining of that intestine and encyst. They kind of create themselves a little capsule and they just hang out. All right. Unfortunately, the majority of our dewormers cannot penetrate that cyst or capsule, and those worms are just living their life, hanging out, not developing, not affecting the horse currently, but can again in the future. All right, so unfortunately, we think of small strongyles as everywhere, ubiquitous, okay? So they rarely cause major disease, but all of your horses probably have some strongyles living within them. Only if we get overabundance of them do they cause a lot of damage. And certainly if they're going from that encysted dormant stage to an adult stage, then they can certainly cause damage to that intestinal lining as their cyst ruptures. We do see diarrhea, weight loss, and even protein loss with these parasites. Do you guys know what ventral edema is? What does ventral mean? Back to those anatomy sessions. Nope. So ventral is going to refer to a portion of the horse. So we have dorsal, meaning along their dorsum or back. And then we have the opposite, that is ventral, along their abdomen. So their bottom side. So ventral edema, what's edema? Swelling, so fluid within the tissue. So ventral edema is going to be swelling of their belly. So their barrel will oftentimes have a little ledge of swelling along it if their protein levels get too low. So certainly a sign of more severe, serious disease. All right, how do we control small strongyles? Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of drug resistant to these parasites. All right, so many of our farms will even have resistance to more than one dewormer. All right, so we need to be careful about overusing dewormer. The answer is not just give them more. There's a lot of husbandry that has to take effect and making sure we're using the proper dewormer at the proper stage for what we have on the farm. You guys understand what resistance means? I see head nods. What does it mean? Excellent. So some of these parasites have adapted to our drugs and they no longer work on them. So they are resistant to that type of dewormer. All right. We've got a few drugs that actually can help with those encysted stages. Our standard pyrantel, ivermectin will not get them when they're hanging out in the intestine. Our moxidectin and high doses of fenbendazole used over multiple days can kill those off. All right, but really we've seen so much resistance to fenbendazole, I don't use it anymore. Anybody know what that used to be called when you would do it for 5 days in a row? You'll hear people still talk about it. So it's called a power pack. So the idea was it was packaged all together, 5 days of dewormer, all in a row at double the dose. So the goal was you hit them with a lot of drug day after day after day. And the theory is as some worms were killed off, the new ones would emerge from their cysts, and then you could kill them off again. If they're resistant to the drug, it doesn't matter how frequently you do it or how much of it you give, it doesn't work. So moxidectin is typically the drug we use now for these horses. Anybody know the trade name of it? If you went to the tack store, what would you buy it as? There's only one on the market. It's the most expensive one out there. It's called Quest. So Quest is the trade name. Currently, they still have, they are the only company that has approval on it. So you can only get moxidectin in the form of Quest. Eventually, there will be generics that come out. We haven't seen those yet. But moxidectin is the name of the drug within Quest. So those blood worms, large strongyles, we talked a little bit, I think, about last time. Do we see these? Not typically, all right? So we talked a little bit about these as related to colic, because when we did have a lot of bloodworms or large strongyles, we had a lot of bad colics associated with them because they would actually migrate along the blood vessels of the intestines and they would form these big blood clots. And that's what you see in the picture on the left, that they've actually caused incredible inflammation and clotting in those vessels. If we've got a blood clot in the vessel, then our intestine doesn't have blood supply, it dies, and our horse becomes violently colicky. All right, so luckily we've eradicated these for the most part. We still can see them on occasion, but it's rare. All right, so I just said all that so you don't have to read it. But really they are sensitive to all the dewormers on the market. So we really don't have to worry too much about resistance at this point. All right, so roundworms or ascarids, what type of horses get these? What's that? Young horses, excellent. So we talked about this last time, right? That signalment matters. So typically foals, weanlings, yearlings are going to be our key for getting roundworms. What does a roundworm look like? So Greg has a small jar of them. Those are actually dog roundworms. Same idea, but in horses, they can get 20 times bigger than that. So to me, they look like spaghetti. So they're long and white to off-white. They tend to cluster, so we get lots of them. And they can be up to a foot long and as big around as a pencil. All right, so what happens to that horse if you deworm it? And they have all those worms in them. They can get an impaction of worms. And we've actually taken horses to surgery and had so many worms in there that we couldn't get them out. And, you know, we can see horses actually die from roundworm impactions. So we deworm baby horses a little bit different than our older horses, and this is why. The roundworms tend to be what kill the babies, and so we want to make sure that they don't have time to build up to huge levels or to really large parasites. Tiny worms are easy to pass. Big pencil-like worms are harder to pass. All right, typically in our babies, we're going to see coughing and nasal discharge. Why do you think that? That's weird. Why would they be coughing and have nasal discharge? Thank you for demonstrating, but no. So it's not the adults that cause the coughing and nasal discharge. The larvae. So what did we say some of the larvae do? They migrate. So migrate means they go out of the intestine through the tissues, and they actually go into their lung tissue and thereby causing inflammation and damage. So coughing and nasal discharge from parasite migration. All right. Otherwise, we can see poor body condition and poor growth rates in these youngsters because those worms are taking what? Nutrients or food from them, absolutely. So rough hair coat, pot-bellied appearance, and certainly if they're severe, we can see colic episodes. All right, so the blockage or impactions are certainly the worst case scenario, but oftentimes do require surgery if it gets to that level. So certainly, you know, we don't like to see colic surgeries in an adult horse. The last thing we really want to be doing is taking a baby to surgery, right? So typically those worms themselves are hanging out, taking all the nutrients, having fun, and it's actually us that causes the problem is we try to kill them, right? So we give them a dose of dewormer, all the worms let go at once, and they all travel downstream and get stuck. So typically in our history, when we're talking about that colicky horse, we're going to see them just post deworming a day or two. I gave him a dose of dewormer. I don't know why he could be colicking. This is why. It's not the dewormer itself. It's the dying off of those worms. Questions on the roundworms? All right, tapeworms. Next one are tapeworms. Tapeworms cause colic. Does anybody remember the type of colic we talked about last time with tapeworms? You look back at the notes you took last week. All right, so our tapeworms actually cause a very specific type of colic. Most of the time, we don't see this if we're deworming them even once a year, but we need a very specific dewormer for tapeworms. So our tapeworm life cycle actually goes through a tiny mite as an intermediate host. The orbitid mites typically live on the pasture. So we rarely see this in horses that do not consume pasture. So if you've got a show horse that never eats grass, they're less likely to get tapeworms. Not to say you can't get some in hay, but most of the time they're going to transmit this on a pasture situation. All right, so they're going to eat up the mite with the grass and ingest that larva. All right, so tapeworm infections are going to happen where that small intestine enters the cecum. All right, so we have, remember we did our digestive tract, our small intestine went into the cecum. What is the cecum? It's the fermentation vat, excellent. So what's unique about the fermentation vat of the horse? It's a one-way street. So things that go in have to come out the same way. All right. So there's no entrance exit. Everything goes in and back out the same hole. All right. So at that junction, then for the next place the ingesta goes is where? So we went small intestine, we dumped it into the cecum, it ferments in there, it comes back out and goes to the large colon. The large colon. All right, so the large colon is going to take all of that material on. So we have this three-way junction, and this is where our tapeworms like to hang out, at the very end of the small intestine, the ileum, and we call it the ileocecocolic junction. So those three pieces of intestine all join up together. What will happen is they can actually telescope in. Anybody remember what that disease is when the intestine telescopes in on itself? So that's an intussusception, all right, where you've got two layers of intestine, where the intestine kind of tries to eat itself. Tapeworms are known for causing that, all right? So most horses, as long as we're deworming them once a year for tapeworms, these have a very slow life cycle. They take 3 months at least to develop. So as long as we're getting them once a year, we're pretty happy. All right, so praziquantel is our typical dewormer for these guys. You can do a double dose of pyrantel. We did that for a long time until they came out with praziquantel, which is much more effective. So anybody know what dewormers you'll find with praziquantel in it? So praziquantel is a drug that only gets tapeworms. It doesn't get any of your other worms. So it's always added to a different dewormer. The plus, excellent. So if you've got Quest, you've got moxidectin. If you get the plus version, it has praziquantel added in. The other option is Zimectrin Gold. So your Zimectrin has your ivermectin in it, and your Gold adds in the praziquantel. And then the third one is Equimax. Equimax has a maximum in it, so it has both ivermectin as well as praziquantel in it. That's how I remember them. So your plus, your Gold, and your max all have tapeworm in it. So that type of dewormer, how often? Once a year. Excellent. All right, so we do see other internal parasites, lungworms. Donkeys are actually the natural host to this parasite, but they rarely show symptoms. Horses can get lungworms if there's donkeys living with them. So certainly, if we have a horse that's coughing and they live with a donkey, lungworms is going to be high on our list. Whereas if there's no donkeys around, we may have other diseases higher on our list. Hives, influenza, other causes of coughing. All right, who's seen pinworms before? Nobody? You have? Are they gross? Yeah, of course they are. They're all gross. But what do pinworms do that all the other worms don't do? It's in this picture, but
they like naturally come out.
Yeah, so they actually crawl out, lay eggs around the anus, along their butt cheeks, and then they crawl back inside. All right, it's gross. I've only lifted up a tail like twice and actually seen one doing that, and it kind of makes you want to vomit, but it happens. So that's their natural way of getting the eggs out to where they can infect another horse. All right, so those pinworms, as they lay those eggs, if you lift up your horse's tail and you ever see like a white or yellow milkiness around there, those are typically pinworm tracks. That's where the female came out, laid eggs, and then crawled back in. All right, so that discharge with the eggs in it is itchy. So the horse rubs its tail. All right, they rub their butt, they rub their tail. And they rub it on the walls, on the bars, on their buckets. And then what happens? The horses lick the bars, they lick their buckets, and they re-ingest those worms, or another horse comes along and eats their worms. All right. So unfortunately, we do see some resistance to ivermectin with these. So oftentimes we need to pick a different category of dewormer. All right. People get pinworms as well. Gross. But they have their own variety. They're not from the horse. So not our fault if that happens. Questions on pinworms? Okay. Your face says it all. All right, so other intestinal parasites we're going to talk today, bots. Who's ever seen bots on their horse? All right, what do they look like? What are you seeing? They're little dots, yep, on their legs. What are those? What part of the bot life cycle is that? The eggs, excellent. So bot eggs, they're typically yellow to white. They're tiny, so they look like a speck of dust or, you know, a little piece of hay. So sometimes it's hard to tell if it's a little dandruff or a little egg. How do we know? It does typically have a little yellow tint to it. They're stuck. They don't go anywhere. You can't brush them away. All right. So they're kind of almost glued on there. And so if it's dandruff or hay, you should be able to brush it away. If they remain stuck there, they're probably bot eggs. How do those bot eggs get there? The bot fly. Excellent. Anybody ever see a bot fly before? They look like little bees. Excellent. They're brown, so they don't have yellow coloring like honeybees, but they look like little bees, and they're actually blind. They tend to sometimes congregate around manure piles, because that's where horses, you know, congregate as well to defecate. So as the horse comes along, they actually will bump into their legs and deposit their eggs around their legs. They're pretty smart. They tend to only deposit them on their legs. All right. So I rarely see bot eggs on their back or on their neck or even on their face, which is good because the horse can't reach them there and they would just die. So how do those eggs get in the horse? The horse licks them. Yeah. So the horse takes his mouth and licks them off its legs. All right. They then burrow into the tongue, the gums, and travel down into their stomach. All right. Once in their stomach, they actually become these large larvae. So that's what that picture is on the left. They can be up to an inch long. They kind of look like a warble, if anybody's seen a warble before, or like a really, really fat, big maggot, but they're brown. So they hang out in the stomach. Rarely do we see them cause a lot of problems unless they're like this horse and that's all they have in their stomach is bots. So certainly that causes damage to their stomach lining, and obviously they're eating nutrients. Eventually these larvae let go, travel through the entire intestinal tract, and get pooped out to where they hatch and become a bot fly. All right, so if we're looking at a fecal sample, we will not see these. All right, if you see them, they're going to be large and big, and it's not something we're going to pick up on the microscope. We're going to pick it up under examination of the manure. But if the manure is not fresh, these things actually larvate and fly away, and you never see them. Okay, so those are bots. How do you get rid of bots?
You can get rid of the eggs using the
Excellent. So a bot knife or a slicker brush. So they're kind of like the hard sponges that are usually black. They're like a pumice stone. And basically you scrape them off of the horse's legs. So yes, if you see bots eggs, you would want to get them off before they have the chance to get here. What else? What if you miss some? So bots are only susceptible to ivermectin and moxidectin. So there's only two types of dewormers that are going to get the bots. So typically the reasoning for using ivermectin at least once a year is aimed at getting the bots. And that can be in conjunction with your tapeworm medication as a plus or a max, but ivermectin type drugs are the ones that get bots. All right, thread worms, typically these are very young foals and they actually transmit through the milk of the mare. So this is the reason why we deworm mares before they foal, is because they can pass those thread worms right on to the baby with that first milk. All right, so you've got a newborn baby and they're already infected. All right, so how do we know that our horse has parasites? All right, a dull, rough hair coat may be an indicator. They're unthrifty or losing condition or hard to put condition on. If they're a young horse and they're not growing well, if they're pot-bellied, especially those young horses that could have what we call wormy bellies, that those ascarids can actually take up quite a bit of room inside and cause that appearance, in addition to taking away proteins and causing fluid losses. And then certainly our more severe ones, colic and diarrhea. Certainly in our well-kept horses, we don't allow them to get to that point. But if we have a horse that we've rescued or whatnot, they could actually have quite severe parasite problems. So what are we going to do about it? All right. So our fecal egg counts are the answer. How many of your horses have had a fecal egg count? Everybody's excellent. All right. Anybody know what their horse's worm counts are? Cool. So I think this could be a good spring project. When your horses get their spring vaccines, have your vet do a fecal egg count. Or if you've already gotten your vaccines, bring a fecal sample in and figure out what their fecal egg count is. If you bring one to a meeting, we can run one here. All right, so our goal is to figure out what dewormer to use and how often and which horses need to be done. All right, so certainly, you know, sometimes it takes time. It's not something I can tell you in one day. We cannot tell based on the eggs if they're resistant or not. But if we deworm them and they still have eggs, then they must have been resistant to that dewormer. All right, so the biggest thing with fecal egg counts are about 20% of our horses carry about 80% of the worms, which means 80% of the horses aren't the problem. All right, so we need to make sure we're focusing our deworming efforts on the right horses. The ones with the high counts are going to have more issues, cause more problems, create more contamination of your farm, and then require more deworming to get them normal. All right, so certainly our babies, we're looking for both ascarids and strongyles. In our adult horses, we're typically looking for mainly strongyles. All right, so we need to know who's infecting the pasture and keeping them at a low level. All right, so even horses that have a 0 type egg count or a low egg count, they still have worms. Our goal is not to make them completely negative. Our goal is to keep them under control. And actually, the new research all says that some degree of parasitism is actually helpful. There's some symbiosis there that those parasites help with other things. And so we tend to see more diarrhea from other causes if we have 0 counts. C. diff, salmonella, things like that have been associated with 0 worm counts. We don't report ours out as 0. We report them out as less than 25. That's the lowest number we can count based on our dilution efforts of getting those fecal egg counts. Because we're not looking at the whole pile of manure or all the manure that horse made in 24 hours. We're getting a tiny little sample and we're trying to extrapolate from that how many worms this horse has. And so even a 0 count isn't 0, it's less than whatever our bar is that we can count. So we report ours out as less than 25. Anything less than 200, we call low. So as long as they don't have more than 200 eggs in a gram of manure, we're cool with it. All right, sounds like a lot, but it's not. As we get higher, 200 to 500, we start to say, hey, that's a few more than we want, but you know, not critical. Worm counts over 500 certainly are those 20% we want to target more frequently. And so that fecal egg count helps us put a horse in a category. Most horses over time will stay in that category. That's how their immune system works. That's how their parasite levels are. And even with regular deworming, they will stay in that higher end. There are other things we can do of environmental management to help that as well. Deworming is not the only answer. All right. So nothing's 100% effective. There's always going to be worms in other stages that aren't susceptible to those dewormers. All right, so we need to keep them at bay. We don't need to keep them at 0. All right, so deworming programs are going to depend on your farm, your pasture management, and like we said at the beginning, our geographic location. How much freezing weather do we get? How much hot, sunny, dry weather do we get? That can actually be more drying on our parasites than our cold weather. All right. Our 3 most common ways of deworming are going to be through an oral paste, a feed additive, whether that's powder, liquid, or pellets, or to stomach tube them. All right, back in the day, our dewormers weren't great, or they came in large volumes, or they tasted really bad. So we tube wormed a lot of horses. So we take a tube, just like when they're colicky, stick it down their throat, and then administer the dewormer that way. We now have a lot of really good paste on the market. There's really no need to be doing that. And it's really no fun to be shoving tubes down horses' noses. All right, so a lot of our products are now made into a form that's happy and apple flavored, and we can just give it to them with a paste. There are a few ones now on the market that come in pelleted form. So for those horses that just will not allow you to deworm them, they don't like their mouth touched, this can be an easy way to get their dewormer in. We just always want to make sure that we're addressing the individual horse, getting the right amount in them, that nobody's stealing their dewormer, that they're not spitting it out, that they're getting a weight appropriate dose. All right, so really all of these parasites we're talking about today are transferred via manure, other than bots. So good management is essential. So too many horses on one farm leads to overgrazing, leads to pasture contamination, and leads to more parasites within the horse. So getting rid of manure regularly. So twice a week is typically enough to get rid of them. Why? Why don't we have to do it every day? Excellent. They have to hatch. It typically takes them several days to hatch out of the manure. So as long as we're keep cleaning it up 2 to 3 times a week, we will prevent most of those from being able to hatch out of the manure, and we get them while they're still within the poop balls. Once they hatch and start to crawl away, then we can't pick them up. All right, so composting of manure if we're going to spread it, or hauling it off site. Either one are options. Most of us don't really have the time to be picking up the pastures, but we can pick up at least where they like to hang out, where they eat. And certainly if we've got large pastures, horses preferentially do not poop where they eat. All right, they'll have their rough areas and their lawn areas, and they poop in certain spots and eat in others if they have enough room. All right, so if we're going to spread our manure, we want to make sure it's fully composted first. Mowing or harrowing our pastures can help expose more larvae to the elements, but it only works if it's hot enough, dry enough. If you just move your manure around the pasture and it's not hot or dry, all you've done is taken those larvae from the rough areas and spread them all over the lawn areas. So it really only helps to harrow during the heat of the summer. All right. So they actually don't mind freezing temperatures and they can hang out, but that extreme heat tends to be better for drying them out. Unfortunately, in Ohio, we rarely get heat that high. So we're talking like 100 degrees. So, you know, even 90s in Ohio is not common. So in Florida, they actually have better parasite control from the environment than we do here. All right. We talked about how to get the bot eggs off. That's a lot of bot eggs. That's a problem. Usually you just see a few. So we talked about our fecal egg counts and setting up those deworming programs. Any question on that? So that's going to be specific to your farm, your horse, your deworming program. Important to know when they were dewormed last when we're making up those recommendations for a fecal egg count. If you dewormed yesterday or 3 days ago and I took a fecal today and it's low, I don't know what your horse was last week. Did you kill everything off and now you have a negative sample? Great, but I don't know what it's going to go back to. So I prefer to do fecals before you deworm. So I know what their natural level is, and then I can tell you how frequently you need to deworm from there. Does that make sense? All right, questions on any of that?
So the worms can get resistant to the drugs.
Mhm.
Why haven't the horses been able to evolve to reject the worm?
Excellent question. So some of our horses have, and so almost every horse has become resistant to roundworms by the time they're 18 months of age. That's why we don't see ascarids in adult horses. It's their immune system that actually kicks them. It's not the fact that the worms know they're young. It's the fact that the horse can get rid of them themselves. And so if I see a roundworm in an adult horse, I say, hey, what's wrong with this horse? And so I go, does he have Cushing's? Does he have a reason to where he's all of a sudden got roundworms back? Does he have cancer? Something's messing with his immune system to where he can't kick those parasites anymore. Our small strongyles, I think some of our horses have evolved. The 80% that doesn't need a lot of dewormer has figured out how to keep that type of parasite at bay. And so we just have those 20% of horses that haven't figured it out. And those are the ones we're targeting for our strongyles. Our other ones, they're just different life cycle, different infectivity. They don't bother the horse as much. They've learned to live in the horse, and the horses learn to live with the bots in their stomach type of thing, and it doesn't bother them enough that it generates an immune response. Good question, but maybe over time we will see those change. All right, lots of poisonous plants out there. Again, we're just gonna hit some highlights here. How many of you have poisonous plants in or around your pastures? Yeah, me too. Which ones do you have?
A little bit ago, we found some nightshade.
Cool,
Yeah, that was good. But I don't think we have any right now.
that's good. Susie?
Yeah.
What you got? Greg has buttercups, okay.
I have no buttercups.
Yeah. Anybody else? So we have some black walnut in the back. We've got, not cloves. No, they're not cloves. Some red maple
In the texture.
in or around. Around,
Nightshade wasn't right where the grass was.
sure. All right, so most of these plants can live just fine, and your horses can live just fine in and around them. The problem becomes is when your horse is either accidentally fed these poisonous plants or has nothing else to eat but these poisonous plants. That's when we get into trouble. Occasionally we'll have them contaminating in our hay, and the horses then don't discriminate as much as they would in the wild. And then certainly, you know, especially this time of year where there's not a whole lot of grass left to eat, they tend to look for other things to chew on. All right, and that's when we get into problems. All right, so obviously 1,000-pound animal has to consume more quantities of a toxic plant than smaller animals. So dose is usually our issue. So although Greg has buttercups in his pasture, why is it not a concern? Because they have to eat a ton of buttercups in order to be poisoned by buttercups. Buttercups toxin is not very potent. They need to eat a lot of them, and horses don't like them. So they really have to be starving to eat enough buttercups to cause a problem. All right, so some of our plants, though, it only takes an exposure and not even to be ingested, like black walnut, to cause a problem. All right, so our goal is to try to recognize these poisonous plants so that you can get rid of them. Or if you're walking along on a trail, that your horse isn't eating them as you go, because horses get bored. There was actually a story a couple of years ago of a show horse that died because the owner was hand grazing it, but not paying attention to it. And it started eating the ornamental bushes alongside the fence that were there to be pretty. And the horse actually died because he ate enough of those bushes that it killed him. All right. So even though you think you're just, grazing your horse, you have to be careful. Not all horses are smart. All right, so we're going to talk about the most dangerous ones. And again, these are going to be place specific. So we'll skip some of the ones that we don't see frequently. So bracken fern. Do you guys know anything about bracken fern? Typically in the forest. Yeah, it's like it likes the shade. So typically along the edges of the woods, we'll see bracken fern. So typically they're a couple feet high. They grow in the woods or some open areas that are shaded. They tend to be really hard to get rid of. They have a really good root system, so they stick around. They're in about almost the entirety of the United States. So obviously we have those here. All right, so what's the problem? Bracken fern has a toxin called thiaminase. Thiaminase stops the absorption of B1 vitamin. All right, thiamine or B1 is essential. So it's one of our water-soluble B vitamins, and we can get neurologic nerve impairment if they don't have enough thiamine. All right, so they have to eat a lot of it. So their diet has to be almost a quarter bracken fern for several weeks. All right, so eating a piece of bracken fern on a trail ride, not a problem. If your horse is, you know, stuck in the woods and has nothing to eat, is the only time we really see it being a problem. Okay, so you know, an abandoned pasture that's mostly wooded, we can see this. That, you know, in horses that are neglected, it's rarely something we see, you know, in well-kept horses. All right, so nerve dysfunction with the thiaminase, and we treat them with B vitamins. So B vitamins, water soluble, so you have to treat them basically every day, otherwise they wash the extra thiamine out of their system, but it is a treatable disease if we catch it early enough. All right, poison hemlock, who's seen this before? What does it look like? Excellent. So it looks like Queen Anne's lace. So you probably see a lot more Queen Anne's lace than you do poison hemlock. All right. But poison hemlock tends to like to live along water routes and in the woods. It has a very thick stem, unlike Queen Anne's lace, which tends to grow in open fields and have a really thin stem. All right. These tend to be kind of woody in nature. The stems have purple spots on them. So purple in nature is typically a sign of poison. So snakes and things like that, beetles that are purple are typically bad. All right, so purple spots mean badness. All right, it grows everywhere. So you can see it along the roadside as you're driving. You can see it in the woods along the streams. The leaves, the stems, and even the seeds are toxic. So 4 to 5 pounds is a lethal dose. So again, it's not a bite. It tends to be, they have to really sit there and eat it for a minute in order to get enough of it. And most horses are smart enough that they're like, that's not tasty, I'm not gonna eat it. All right, signs happen pretty rapidly though. So tremors, incoordination, neurologic disease, they get to respiratory failure is typically what kills them. You'll see colic on the list for a lot of these. Again, colic is that, you know, generic abdominal pain sign that horses do, you know, oftentimes before they die. All right, so no specific way to treat this though. So really our goal is, you know, not to let them eat enough of it to die. Good plan, good plan. All right, so ragwort is a group of Senecio plants. The Senecio plants, people call all different names. Groundsel is another name you'll hear for it. It is kind of a little yellow flowered plants. You'll see these on occasion in the pasture. Too many. There we go. So they're everywhere. But you can certainly see them growing, you know, just in a normal pasture. So they contain pyrazolidizing alkaloids, all right? So pyrazolidizing alkaloids are going to depend on the animal as to how problematic they are. I actually have seen issues with liver damage in alpacas from eating these plants. I haven't seen one in a horse, but chronic exposure over time, and it takes a lot of plant, all right? They're not eating 1 or 2 bites, they're eating lots of it. Our liver disease causes a problem called photosensitization, where basically the sunlight combined with the white areas on the horse create this horrible dermatitis. So they get all of these sores, open wounds over their white markings. So whether it's on their nose, their legs, these guys we immediately run blood work on to look for the evidence of liver disease. All right, so no treatment, unfortunately, and they can go into full liver failure when this happens. Our goal is to figure out where they're getting it from. In the alpaca herd they had it in their hay. So they didn't even see it because those yellow flowers were all dried out. So it was hard to identify initially. So Johnson grass, we don't see in this part of the country. You go a little bit south of here and you'll see Sudan grass or Johnson grass. Very large, flat-leafed plants. They can get up to 6 feet in length. And some of them will actually be used kind of as decorative plants. So you'll see them used, you know, in landscaping. Again, typically we're going to see it in the southern states. We don't see it here, so we'll go fast through this one. So basically it contains a cyanide type of compound. So they basically suffocate to death. It's great. So difficulty breathing is going to be what's associated typically with that, with cyanide poisoning. Loco weed is fun to say, but crazy weed we don't see in this part of the US. So if you get out west, you will see more loco weed, but that's a bit about the location of loco weed. So it's a big purple flower. So if you move, you need to figure out, you know, new plants to your area, but we'll skip that one. Who's seen oleander plants? Yeah, these are very common in landscaping. So it's rare that you're going to find them growing in your pasture. But if you're allowing your horse to graze, you know, in and around a showgrounds, and they're looking for things to eat, these are some of the things that can cause problems. So they can get to be big, kind of bushy plants. So natural habitat is in the south, but up here we'll see them planted. All right, red maple. We see lots of red maple. So when are red maple leaves toxic? When they fall and they're wilted. Excellent. So what time of year do we tend to see problems? In the fall. So after a big thunderstorm, we've had branches come down into pastures and the horses go, ooh, a new feast. And they feast on those leaves that have fallen into their pasture. Typically not a problem in the spring and summer when they're nice and green. Mostly red maple only, but there are some varieties of trees that have been cultivated to be partial red maple, so like the celebration maple and all of that potentially have toxic effects as well. But silver maples and other maples are not toxic like the red maple and derivatives of it. All right, so our tree or our wilted leaves are going to be the problem. And I already said all that. All right, so toxins from these wilting leaves actually causes a breakdown of their red blood cells to where they can't transport oxygen. So they get this kind of chocolatey colored blood. So we go to draw blood on this horse that's sick and we're like, ooh, that's the wrong color. All right, their urine tends to get really dark with these toxins as well. So, you know, normally they urinate and it's nice and yellow. They can get to be dark red, brown, or even black colored urine. Certainly a sign of something's wrong. All right, they get very sick very fast, typically within a couple hours, but can last a couple or take a couple days depending on how many they've eaten. All right, so unfortunately their liver, their kidneys, and other organs get damaged with all of those toxins circulating. And it doesn't take a ton of this toxin. So a couple pounds, which, you know, a horse munching on a down branch can do pretty quickly, can be actually fatal. So we can certainly see them sick and be able to treat them, but we also can see it causing death within days. All right, so again, lethargy, they don't want to eat or drink, they get dehydrated, they have that really dark colored urine. All right, so what do? You call the vet, right? If you think your horse has eaten red maple, we're talking hours to days. So you're not going to wait till Monday. You're going to call on the weekend and say, hey, look, we found this down tree in the pasture. My horse has been eating it. All right. So, oh, that talks about the hybrids of red maples. All right. That could be potentially toxic. All right, we'll do a couple more. Water hemlock. All right, so water hemlock is a weed. So this one also kind of has that Queen Anne's lace look, but this is the one that likes to live in the rivers. All right, seen everywhere. So marshy areas, ditches, if you've got a creek in your pasture, you could certainly have some water hemlock. All right, so these tend to have the horse not only have the nervous signs, but also they salivate a lot. So we can confuse it with other diseases. What other diseases causes them to salivate? Rabies. Hopefully they're vaccinated. Clover slobbers, excellent. A much more common presentation. Choke or a foreign body or a bad tooth in their mouth will cause them to slobber as well. All right, so again, they die the same way of respiratory paralysis, so they stop breathing. This happens pretty quickly though. So they start having symptoms within an hour or two, and they can die within a few hours. So they're usually pretty easy to spot. They probably haven't gone too far from where they were eating. All right, I'm gonna skip this one too. All right, who knows what yew bushes are? Where do you see those? Landscaping, all right? So these are the little green bushes that you can kind of carve to be little squares along the front walkways. All right, we see the most problem with these is when people trim those bushes back and then throw the trimmings somewhere where the horses can get them, whether it's on the compost pile or the neighbor throws them over the fence. Many horses will die with these still in their mouth. They're very toxic. So if they have a pile of them and they're chewing on them, they will die before they finish the pile. All right. So questions on any of those? I've got more, but I won't go into all of those today. Save those for another day. Penelope, do you have a question?
So for this one, is it the berries or the needles that are toxic?
All of it. Yeah, so all of it is toxic, but often the way to identify the plant is it's the green plant with the red berries, because there are green plants that don't have red berries that aren't technically yew, but the green part is the toxic portion. I think the seeds are toxic as well. So, yeah. But yeah, no, just even the green part will kill them and quite rapidly. All right, so our goal is to prevent them from eating them. And there's a lot of other things we can talk about, you know, as to other plants that you see, and some of them not as fatal as some of these. So yew is probably the most rapidly fatal. Any questions? All right, I'm going to stop there for the day. Your brains look like they hurt.
Dr. Gebhardt, I have an unrelated question to this, but I was studying teeth before we jumped on here.
Yeah.
What age do the canine teeth come in at?
Typically 5. So between 4.5 and 5.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, awesome. Thank you guys.
Hey, Sandra. It's
Yes.
Bridget.
Yes.
Hey, guys. Just really quick, I wanted to let you know to go to the Google Classroom. There's been some new resources posted there, one of which was a couple of things on poisonous plants.
Awesome.
And the HB test is very specific as to what plants they want to cover. So I'm not sure if I put that out there, but it's on the HB resources page of the website. I'll try to go grab that document for you guys if that's not the one that I posted.